I do think we're in an environment that kind of amplifies those existing tendencies. So the people who are curious and smart and want to be better learners, they will find the ability to do that. And then for the people who want to find a way to distract themselves or, just kill some time, they're going to find that easier too. And, in some ways that competes with more educative things.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
The world needs evidence-based public policy now more than ever. Making the right decisions should not be partisan politics. Please help spread The Rational View by going to patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Together, we can make a better future. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm going to be exploring the science behind learning with an author who's been exploring this topic for almost 20 years. How do we learn and reason? How can we be more rational? And what can we do to make learning easier? If you enjoy what you're hearing, I urge you to press like on your podcast app. I'd love to hear from you on my Facebook group, The Rational View, for any comments and insights you might want to share. Always looking for new ideas for podcasts as well. So feel free to drop by and give me a piece of your mind. Scott Young is the Wall Street Journal best-selling author of Ultralearning, a podcast host, computer programmer, and an avid reader. Since 2006, he's published weekly essays to help people learn and think better. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Pocket, and Business Insider, on the BBC, and at TEDx, among other outlets. He doesn't promise to have all the answers, just a place to start. He lives in Vancouver, Canada. Scott, welcome to The Rational View.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I appreciate you taking the time to come chat with us. So could you tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to be interested in thinking and learning and rationality even?
Yeah, I have kind of an odd background. I really grew up on the internet. So I started writing in 2006 when I was like just wrapping up my last year of high school. And it was very much like I was talking about issues that were close at hand, studying personal productivity, a lot of these ideas. And I just kept doing it for like 2 decades. And since then, I think my viewpoints and my writing have evolved considerably. But the starting point of being interested in learning and being interested in it, again, from a little bit of an outsider perspective, I mean, I think the classic person that you would have to talk about learning would be someone who, they got their PhD in cognitive psychology, and now they're going to come here and tell you about the research program they ran. Whereas I think my background is a lot more eclectic, like not only reading a lot of stuff, and you can go to my website. There's tons of, I have like lots of book reviews of academic textbooks and stuff that I've read, but then also personal learning projects, learning things like other languages and computer science and things like this. So I think that gives it a bit of a personal flavor, maybe that you wouldn't see otherwise.
Mm-hmm. So you have a new book that's coming out called Ultralearning that teaches people how to break out of their old, outdated methods of learning and become ultra learners. You mentioned early in the book, I've had a look at it. It's really, really packed with interesting tidbits, lots of anecdotes, lots of background on the science of learning. Mm-hmm. You mentioned early on that humans aren't any better at solving problems than like chimps or crows, which was interesting to me. Do you remember that section?
Yeah. So first of all, the new book is called Get Better at Anything. Ultralearning was another book about learning that I published about 5 years ago, just a minor errata for that. But this is interesting research. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say like obviously human beings are smarter than crows, but what's interesting is that when you look at, well, I know that's sort of like, do I even need to make that point? But when you look at small children, or you look at human beings that have not been like incredibly educated and influenced by culture and have all this sort of like cognitive machinery that we as adults have, and you compare them on sort of fairly simple tests of problem solving or spatial reasoning and these kinds of things, they don't actually perform that much better than, again, some of the more intelligent apes and birds. Now, again, when you think about like a 10, 12-year-old child, I'm sure that they would just squash any competitors in the animal kingdom on those tests as well. But this idea that what separates us as a species is more our ability to learn socially than to just, solve problems on our own through trial and error is a kind of interesting point, because I think, at least in our culture, we have like expressions like monkey see, monkey do, which is the idea that like imitation and copying and this kind of social learning is a kind of inferior form of learning to, problem solving and raw intellect. And so just the fact that, well, it actually seems to be that we're like excellent at copying. We're excellent at like, someone can solve a problem, show us how they did it, and we can immediately do the same thing ourselves in many instances. And that is something that most animals lack. They don't have the machinery to do that, is very interesting. So I really follow from Joseph Heinrich. He's a Harvard anthropologist and economist. He published a book called The Secret of Our Success, where he really documents this entire body of cultural evolutionary theory, which is making this basic argument that culture and the ability to learn through observation, learn through this kind of accumulated knowledge that has been passed down from generations is really the secret of our success, to use the title.
So you're saying what differentiates us from apes is how well we can ape each other.
In a sense, yeah. And again, I think probably the less flashy answer is that, adult humans with their full cognitive apparatus probably have also greater intelligence and problem solving ability, but that this particular ability, the social learning, the ability to just, learn from other people through observation, is highly developed in humans, and it's mostly absent in even our ape cousins. And that, that prevents culture from accumulating. It prevents, one ape from figuring out how to do something and then having it transmit down the generations. And just that sort of snowballing process of knowledge and accumulated lore and this kind of stuff is so huge to our own sophisticated society that we live in, and we kind of neglect that sometimes in thinking about learning.
Yeah. As an expert on learning methods, you must be very interested in schools and how things are taught in schools. How well are we doing in our schools in adopting the best teaching methods?
Oh, it's hard to say, because I think that every single situation is a little different, that what you're doing in different classes is different. I think there's a lot of stuff that we've learned about what works for teaching and learning that is not universally practiced. Maybe that's the best way to put it. So I know one of the areas that has received a lot of attention, in part because it's so important, and in part because there's been like tons of research done on it, is the science of reading. And this is something that now you see this bubbling up in New York Times op-eds and this kind of stuff, that for a really long time, phonics was kind of on the outs. The idea that you shouldn't really be trying to meticulously teach all the sound spelling combinations in the language. What you should be doing is just like giving kids books and getting them to build this love of reading, and if they can't figure it out, just guess the words and try to look from the pictures and stuff.
It was so weird because, like, I was taught phonics in detail and sound the words out if you don't know them. Well, he comes up with in grade 2 or whatever, he comes up with a word, I don't understand it. He's stuck. He has to come ask me, if he doesn't recognize it. So I thought it was a little bit odd, right?
This was I would say kind of a big thing for a while. And the kind of sad thing about it, and this is maybe somehow made me a little bit pessimistic about the benefits of academic research into practice, is that we've kind of known since, like, I think Gene Hall published The Great Debate in like the 60s. We've known since then that phonics works better. Like, the evidence was clear then. It's just accumulated since then. Marilyn Adams, who I cover her research a lot, she wrote this huge tome called Beginning to Read. And it's also very pro phonics. It's like, we've done tons of studies. Here's the research, is pro phonics. And now we're here like another 30 years later, and the New York Times still has to publish op-eds where people are like, we're teaching the wrong way to read. It's like, well, we've known this for the better part of a century, what the right way to teach to read is. But I think part of the resistance is, again, there's a gap between research and practice in a lot of learning sciences. Second, there's a lot of ideology. I think, especially in education, there's often this tension between a kind of authoritative transmission model of teaching and the kind of more nurturing, humanities focused approach, and that's created some tension. And also, a lot of teachers don't like teaching phonics because it's kind of boring and painstaking, and they'd rather get on with reading and do the thing that they like to do. And so, it's just unfortunate that that all this research has to accumulate and be like, no, this is the right way to teach to read. And I mean, reading is just one skill. It's one component. I don't want to generalize it too broadly to say that like every skill is the same. Certainly learning physics is different from learning to read, and there's different difficulties and different issues. But I think, going through a lot of the research, it's sort of incredible to me that, there can be a lot of research done. There can be a lot of evidence in favor of certain practices. But that's just not what's being applied on the ground. That's not what's being taught in education schools and teacher training programs and so on.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because that's part of what I'm here for in the rational view is to figure out where the science and the practice differ and to bring them more into line. I mean, that's why I'm here. You start off in the book with a really interesting anecdote about Tetris, the old arcade game where the different shaped pieces fall from the top of the board and you have to line them up to fill in complete rows to keep progressing. I was surprised to learn that the current Tetris champs are so much better than say my peers in the arcade 20 years ago. Why is that?
Yeah, so this is kind of a fun story. I first heard about this from the YouTuber John Green when he kind of documented this, and I just thought it was like so fascinating. I was like, okay, next time I write a book, I'm gonna have to like go deep into this story. But the basic idea is that Tetris comes out in North America, at least in the early 90s, and it's a phenomenon. This is like the most popular game in the world. There's people writing these op-eds about how they're hallucinating falling blocks because they're playing this game so much. And, it's a sort of like, oh, this is a throwback. This is a retro kind of game. But it really was cutting edge at the time. This really was like a national, even a global obsession. This was a phenomenon, this game. And like all kinds of things that people get obsessed with, there's some people who get really obsessed and really try to become the best at it. And so even from the early days, there were competitions to see who could be the best at Tetris. Now, the way the old game worked is like one of the sort of indicators of prowess was your score. And so there were 6 digits on the score thing. You couldn't put more digits than that. So the maximum possible score would have been 999,999. That was like called a max out. And because of the way the game works, because of the way the game works, it gets faster and faster and faster until it becomes basically unplayable. And so, the getting a high score was difficult because at some point the game would just be unplayable. You couldn't get past this. And so it was kind of long thought that like, well, maybe someone could get a max out, but it would be very difficult to do. And it was about 20 years into playing the game that someone first documented themselves doing this feat. But the funny thing is that kids these days, I'm talking about like 12, 13-year-old kids, not like the same people who were playing back in the 90s. They're getting this regularly. One of the tournaments that was covered in this New York Times article, I think it was something like 40 different people got max outs in this span of one tournament. And like one guy got it like 14 different times. So we're just talking about like qualitatively different levels of skill. And the theory that I think was, or the explanation that fits the details best about like why kids these days are so much better at Tetris is that the environment is so much more conducive to this social learning that we talked about, that the internet exists. You can watch live streamers. They have video camera of their hand. So you can see what they're like, how they're holding the remote to do some of these difficult like techniques for moving the blocks really fast. And you can get this sort of feedback and practice in this loop that's just much more efficient at transmitting Tetris skill than it was back in the 90s, where it's like, okay, your brother, your friend's older brother, he knows some trick and you try it out. And even when you look at, there was this Tetris documentary that was put out about 10 years ago. And even some of the people who are like, they've been playing this game obsessively for 20 years, used strategies that we like now know are deficient. Like that's not the right way to do it, but they never learned from their mistakes because this knowledge was just kind of in these little islands. It wasn't integrated. It wasn't something that people could build upon. So it really does kind of, follow again this idea that being able to learn from others, makes such a big difference.
That's really cool. So you've obviously done a lot of research. You've been involved in this for a long time.
Yeah.
What would you say is kind of the biggest myth about learning that you want to knock down in this book?
I mean, there's too many. There's some that I think are, I don't know whether it's a myth, but it's like a concept that people lack. So I found the work of Alan Newell and Herbert Simon on problem solving to be fascinating because it really breaks down like what are people doing when they solve problems and what are the kind of limitations on that process. Because I think especially in the kind of more self-helpy end of the advice spectrum. There's all this advice about like, you got to keep working on hard problems and like never give up and this kind of thing. And then you have these people who have like a computer science background being like, oh, actually, most problems are impossible to solve. You can show that mathematically, and that even the ones that are solvable, the problem spaces are often like so big that if you don't have a smart approach, it'll take you longer than the age of the universe to solve it, and this kind of stuff. And so it's not that it's profoundly pessimistic, but it's just reframing what it is to solve problems. So like that's an example where I just felt like I've read all these books about problem solving, but like no one articulated it that way to me before of like, this is what it actually is to solve problems. Myths about learning. I think probably one of the biggest ones is the idea that the mind is like a muscle. This one, everyone holds this idea that,
it was hammered into us.
Yeah, you like that the reason for learning things is that it makes you smarter in some broader sense, that you just, you do Sudoku puzzles and it like hones your logical reasoning. And I've heard this from people, like I did art because it makes me more creative, or I learned programming because it helps me think logically. And the problem with these ideas is there is like some defensible way that that's partially true. I mean, if you learn to program, you're learning some mental models that do carry over to other domains. But the big thing is that the metaphor is wrong. It's not that the mind is like, a bicep that you strengthen it and then it's just like good for all these tasks. It's more like a collection of tools. And so learning and developing broad faculties, broad mastery is having a lot of different tools, having a lot of different methods, having a lot of different ways to explore this problem space, as it were, so you can cut down these, quintillions of possibilities into one that you can just solve straight away. And so I think that idea and that shift, I think it has lots of implications for learning and for education. But, if you're stuck on the wrong metaphor, you're going to keep going down dead ends.
Interesting. Yeah, that's definitely one that was like hammered into people for a long time. Always told that the brain was a muscle. Like, okay, I don't think it's a muscle, but all right. You tell me that, I'll believe you. So I found in the book, your discussion of working memory was fascinating. Could you summarize what we know about working memory and its impact on learning and expertise?
So working memory is one of the most, I would say, celebrated findings in cognitive psychology, or really like even before cognitive psychology, because George Miller's work predate the cognitive revolution in psychology. But the basic idea is that we can only keep track of a few things consciously in our mind at a particular time. And George Miller's original paper was like the magic number 7 plus or minus 2, which sort of pegged it to like you can have between 5 and 9 things in your head at once. More careful research, which like involves fairly sophisticated techniques and stuff, shows that number is probably closer to 4. Like it's a smaller number than that. But the idea is that we can only hold a very few number of things in our head. And so most of learning deals with this problem, because pretty much any skill that requires thinking or decision-making at all has to go through this bottleneck. And when you don't have experience with this skill, when you don't have some of these strategies, like I talk about chunking, I talk about retrieval cues, that are ways of sort of bypassing this limitation, you get stuck, because something that is trivial to someone who has a lot of experience, that they have the ability to, just see, okay, there's these 3 patterns and I can make sense of this whole field. It might be like 20 or 30 pieces of information. It's impossible for them to make sense of it. And so this bottleneck, this constraint, is probably the most important factor in learning generally, especially intellectual skills. And I talk about cognitive load theory, John Sweller's work on there, which has just sort of taken this central, inarguable feature of the human mind that pretty much no one doubts, and started like, well, what are the educational implications of that? Like, what does that mean about how we should be teaching, how we should be learning, how we should be practicing? And often taken to places that, I think people will be surprised about, that it's, not always the way that we're taught things in school.
Yeah, that was really cool to me. And like, I wonder if there's been any speculation on the mechanism of why there's just 4 things, and how do I upgrade that RAM?
Well, I mean, the number of things is like, if we really want to get into the weeds, it gets really complicated, because, the number of things is sort of like trying to be a measure of like how much information is being held, but like the mechanism is really complicated. So you have all these different proposed theories of like how this is like implemented in the brain. And I know ACT-R, which I talk about very like, glancingly in the book, but this is John Anderson's, really sophisticated theory of cognitive science, he kind of used it as this sort of spotlight that kind of like all of our memories have like some amount of attention, but because this spotlight literally limits how much can be actually used and manipulated, so it's in his model, it's not actually literally four things. It's just there's this kind of exponential decay of like how active certain memories are. There's theories, this global workspace theory of consciousness also argues that there's a kind of like threshold mechanism. So we have this sort of like unconscious activation of memories, ideas, images, and they sort of need to hit a kind of threshold. And then they sort of like, once they hit that threshold, then those sort of images or those ideas populate the brain and they link up different areas of the brain so that we can do more sophisticated things with them. And so like in that theory, there's really only kind of one thing that's going on right now. So it's a little bit of a different measure. It's not really saying like whatever four things are being populated, they have to somehow be combined in some way. And so I don't know, the mechanisms are really complicated and I think they're more speculative. So I didn't really get into it that much in the book. But I mean, from a purely behavioral point of view of like, how much can people store in their heads? I mean, there's just so much research that's been done on that. So we're fairly confident that, working memory is a thing, or the short-term memory store is a thing. And we have some really good constraints on, what must be, but the architecture of it, I think, is a little bit more open-ended. They're still figuring that out.
And the theory goes that what differentiates the expert from the novice is that they're able to group more things under in a single box, basically, and it becomes one item in your working memory that you can work with. So if you can recognize patterns or behaviors as a single, somehow cohesive element, then you can treat it as one thing in this working memory and work with it. Whereas the novice doesn't recognize this as just a bunch of separate things.
This is pretty easy to demonstrate. This is this idea of chunking, and like the best way to do that was with acronyms. So I'm going to be making a blunder at it because I'm going off of my own memory here. But if you give like someone 9 letters, right, and you ask them to remember those 9 letters, they're going to struggle with it. They're going to have a hard time remembering it. But if I say those same letters reorganized into like MBA, NBA, FBI or something, people have no difficulty remembering those 3 things. But it's the same 9 letters, right? And so even Miller, when in his original paper, he kind of proposed this as a mechanism from like the first get-go of suggesting this idea, was that, well, one of the things that we're able to do is learn patterns in memory so they take up less space. So sort of, there's lots of been proposals about how this chunking works, but this idea that like you're binding together pieces of information, you learn that, and then you store it in long-term memory, and then it doesn't require as much information to dredge up. Now, Anders Ericsson, Walter Kinch had like an additional theory, which is that as you use a skill, you also get better at like kind of almost like leaving breadcrumbs for yourself, so you can reflect back on your long-term memory and pick up where you left off. And if you don't have a lot of practice, it's very difficult to do that. And so they studied people who were working on their digit span. Digit span is this task where you like give someone a list of numbers and they're like, what was, the 8th number back from what we talked about. And for most people, this end back test is like, it's extremely hard because you have to keep kind of like a conveyor belt sequence of numbers in your head. And for most people, you have a very small window of this. But Anders Ericsson worked with this guy over a number of months. And over that practice session, he was able to increase his digit span to like some ungodly number, like 100 or something. And he did it by kind of creating this very sophisticated mnemonic strategy of like clustering the numbers together and doing this kind of thing. And so the theory, at least, is that for some kinds of skills, this is maybe also how we're doing it. Walter Kinch talks about it in story comprehension that, if you give people numbers and then you have some distractor and then ask them what the numbers are, they're pretty bad at remembering them. But if you give someone a story, so you tell them a story about something, but in between each sentence, you insert some nonsense things not related to the story, they can actually still remember the story fairly well. I mean, I don't want to say that it's as easy as reading it off the bat, but it's certainly not the case that you forget the whole story. And so the theory, at least, is that for certain types of skills, certain types of information, we have this ability to like quickly encode it in our long-term memory and then create some kind of retrieval cue so we can remember not just, stories in general, but this particular story that we're listening to. So the idea of both of these mechanisms, retrieval cues and chunking, is really that they're something only available to the expert. There's something that you develop through practice, through experience, that make it easier for you to deal with a lot of information simultaneously. But when you're starting out, it doesn't matter how smart you are, you don't have those tools. And you could be the smartest person on the planet and you're still going to really struggle with new skills and new domains.
Yeah, unless you have like eidetic memory, which I don't understand at all. But there are a few people that can, remember everything that they've ever read or every
Yeah,
date
that's
that
a really
they've
there's a
ever.
lot of controversy around that. I remember reading about like photographic memory, and there are some people that like claim to have photographic memories, but they often it's not clear when you test them whether or not they actually do. So, I mean, I haven't dug it fully into the controversy. I don't want to like say
Okay.
like 100% certainty it doesn't exist, but certainly the idea of photographic memory, if not something that like no one possesses, it's something that it's questionable, like whether this is really actually overturning our paradigm of how thinking works. That whether or not it's something that is a real phenomenon.
One thing I learned from skimming through your book, which was really interesting to me because I had a misconception, was about the difference between novice chess players and grandmasters. Like I always assumed that grandmasters were going 5 or 6 moves beyond,
Yeah.
figuring out, exactly what, if I move here, then he's going to move here, then I'm going to move here. And you basically stated that no, they just are better at recognizing better moves.
Yeah.
And so they don't look at moves that are worse, whereas the novice can't distinguish between these types of moves, but they're not going like 5 or 6 steps beyond anyone else. They just have better understanding of the patterns on the board. So that was really cool.
So there's this is like the kind of the classic study of a lot of cognitive science that Adrian de Groot, he was this Dutch chess player and psychologist, and he did one of the first studies of chess, like how do people perform chess. And then Herbert Simon and William Chase, they took this up and did more studies in America. And this became kind of like one of the founding studies of this discipline of expertise, of like studying what's the difference between people who know a lot and people who don't know that much, and just trying to be quantitative about it. And it is true that in the original de Groot studies, the best chess players and the other players that were being studied were not novices. They were like, kind of amateur players that they like played every once in a while, but they weren't like super, super good. But they're not like, right. I've never played chess before kind of players. And in those players, there wasn't a huge difference in search depth. Now, I think more recent studies, I talk about Charnas as a paper where he talks about how if you expand the range of quality, there does seem to be some difference, but it's not really enough to explain why the grandmasters are good. Like the difference seems to be that grandmasters quickly latch on to what are good moves in this situation. And so everything they explore is so much more fruitful because they immediately know, okay, this is the top move. This is the like top 3 moves that I should even consider. And so if they do look a little bit, maybe 1 or 2 moves deeper than someone who's quite novice at the game, they're just much more profitable in how they're able to look through these moves. And so the theory of chunking was basically that it's this perceptual skill that you've built all these patterns in memory, and what the chess player, what the grandmaster is doing is applying this kind of recognition cued decision maker. You're like, oh, this is the pattern in the chess, this is the right kind of move. And so any kind of logical analysis that proceeds after that fact is going to be much more efficient. So you can take the same number of like looking ahead moves, and you just get much better positions than the person who doesn't have that experience.
Yeah, I've actually read that the field of chess, the ability of the top players has taken off recently thanks to the chess engines, the artificial intelligences that can beat the world champion. So humans are now learning from the chess engines what the best moves are, and how to get better than human play. And I think this has a lot of impact for a lot of fields coming from artificial intelligence. Like artificial intelligence is here, and it's going to be taking over a lot of different areas where it's going to get better than the people. So, many people are very pessimistic, but I'm very optimistic that, by learning from the AI, we're all going to get smarter. And so, imagine what else we're going to learn from our new overlords as general AI gets smarter.
I mean, I completely agree. I think of so many skills that where the real constraint is having access to experts, is having access to people who know so much more than you, not just so you can get explanations and teaching, but just so that you can easily like see and explore that play. And so if you have an AI assistant for a lot of skills, it just dramatically lowers that cost and time bottleneck of getting access to the most proficient people. I mean, I'm not a really big chess player, but one area where I immediately saw the implications is once they ChatGPT became really popular, was for language learning. Now, if you want to learn a language in a good way, you need to have some kind of practice, some kind of dialogue, some kind of like back and forth, correct my mistakes, this kind of thing. And the best way to do that is usually talking to native speakers. But for a lot of languages, especially if you don't live in the country that speaks it, it's a real obstacle to get that access. You have to pay for a tutor. You're often paying a lot of money. You're scheduling up times. Whereas now you basically have a machine that is to a first approximation fluent in like every language, and you can just like get it to be like, okay, just dialogue with me endlessly on this and correct my mistakes, is just something that until a couple of years ago would have just been impossible. You couldn't have done that. So I really do think that these AI expertise or this AI tutors is going to help at least in some skills, or at least some components of the skills that they do particularly well.
So as another aspect of this working memory and becoming experts and being able to group anything, you mention a kind of a drawback. You explain why experts don't make the best teachers. And I think you make a good point that knowledge becomes invisible with expertise. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is like a common finding again in these expert novice differences, that when you gain knowledge in a field, one of the things that happens is that parts of the skill that you've learned, maybe explicitly, deliberately at some point, become automated. They become proceduralized. They become something that you do intuitively, and they become tacit knowledge. And the problem is that, not that you forget everything about your formal training, and that can obviously help you if you're going to be coaching someone else, but that because you rely on it less, and because maybe you learn things through tacit knowledge directly, like just through repetitive experience, you kind of learn this is the right way. Don't do this, do this. And you can't really even articulate the reasons for it. It means that a new person coming to that field is going to have a hard time, particularly for cognitive and intellectual work, just from seeing what you're doing, or even seeing what you're doing with some kind of cursory explanation, trying to emulate it themselves. And so a lot of what a good teacher does is sort of not only have to learn the skill, but then they have to break the skill back down so that you can go through that working memory bottleneck and kind of build back up to that level. And so I think that's one of the barriers to learning complex intellectual skills in practice, is that, you have a physics background. I'm sure if I just sat with you and you were just like on a chalkboard solving some physics problem, it would make no sense to me, because without being almost at the level of skill that you have with that knowledge, I can't make sense of the steps you're taking. And so physics is like an extreme example, but really across many domains, that's a barrier to learning from experts. And it is one reason why, having a good teacher is so important.
Yeah. And you would think we'd be getting a lot smarter with the internet out there, but it seems like in general, discourse is becoming dumbed down. While we have the ability to become smarter, the general discourse seems to be dumbed down. Do you have any perspective
I
on
don't know.
that?
I personally, I made this argument in my previous book, Ultralearning, that I really see technology and the internet in general as being this kind of, it amplifies the extremes. I think the smartest and most interested people now are smarter and more insightful than they were 20, 30 years ago, because the access to expertise has become democratized. You can read the academic papers, you can read the data. And so, when I follow smart pundits who talk about things, I think just the quality of analysis and insight is just much greater than it was before. But on the other hand, there's just like infinite distractions, infinite kind of like entertainment and stuff. And the fact is that like 99% of people, that's not what they want to do. They don't want to I want to go through the original data and do the regression myself and show where the flaws were. No, they want to look at cat videos or this kind of thing. And so I do think we're in an environment that kind of amplifies those existing tendencies. So the people who are curious and smart and want to be better learners, they will find the ability to do that. And then for the people who want to find a way to distract themselves or, just kill some time, they're going to find that easier too. And, in some ways that competes with more educative things.
In terms of myths that you debunk, you mentioned another one that I've been aware of for some time, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, that practice does not make perfect. And my favorite correction to that is practice makes permanent.
Yeah.
Only perfect practice makes perfect. So that's also a common myth, I think, that people don't understand, is that practice is reinforcing what you know. But if you don't know how to do things right,
Yeah.
you're just reinforcing the wrong thing. And that also ties into what you were saying, which came as a surprise, that practicing one thing doesn't make you necessarily better at another thing. Like there was a lot of online claims for puzzle games that will keep you from getting Alzheimer's or keep you from being dementia. Like, so what does the research say on that? I mean, you've looked at the
brain
research on
training
this sort of
stuff.
thing?
Yeah, the brain training stuff is really pessimistic. And it's one thing where, like, I opened that thing with talking about the FTC lawsuit against Lumosity, because for a long time, every time I'd open up my web browser, there'd be some Lumosity, this like white background, and it looks almost like vaguely medical. And they're like, improve your game with, proven brain training things. And the Federal Trade Commission just kind of slapped them down and said, like, we're suing you. You can't say this anymore. And it's partly one of those areas where there is a gap between research and practice, or research and popular perception. Is, again, this mind muscle metaphor is so prevalent, so kind of implicitly accepted, that if I say to you, oh, okay, I've got this sort of tool and it's going to give you these cognitively challenging exercises that's going to keep your mind fit, very few people would object to that. Very few people would be like, well, that sounds fishy to me. That it would be like, that makes sense, right? And because that makes sense, you can make kind of unsupported claims about that, and people will just, it passes the smell test. Now, again, as I said, that's probably the wrong metaphor for the brain. It doesn't seem like it works that way. And I review a lot of research, quite, I would say, like, studies with tons of participants, high-powered studies, this kind of thing, that show like, no, probably doesn't work. Now, I don't want to say that's the final word. There's a group of researchers that are pretty dedicated to showing that it does offer some benefit. And every time I talk about this, I get some email from a reader be like, but what about this study? Or this is the right way to do it. And to me, I just feel like, I kind of feel like the case has been closed on that for a while. I feel like Edward Thorndike back, 120 years ago, basically put the nail in the coffin of that idea. And we're just sort of living under the shadow of people trying to show why he's wrong. Now, I think that a better metaphor, like if you do want to have a better cognitive performance, is to think again of this idea of the mind as being this collection of tools. And so the way to have a sharper thinking is to have more tools, to have more knowledge, to know more things. And so in that sense, mental improvement is possible, but it's very different from the muscle metaphor. It's very different from the, like, I'm going to do these Sudoku puzzles until I'm like, yeah, it'll make you really good at the Sudoku puzzles and maybe also some similar games, but it's not going to make your brain smarter. Whereas if you know tons of things about tons of stuff, and we all know people that are just like really widely read and they've practiced and learned lots of skills, they can pick up new things easily because the lifetime of knowledge they accumulate just happens to overlap with lots of stuff. And that's, the fairly straightforward way that they get better at things. And so I'd rather be the second type of person than the first.
I feel like I've read stuff though that says that, the more active mentally that the more you challenge the brain, the less likely you're going to get dementia or stuff like that. Is that not really supported?
I don't know. I mean, the idea of the relation between cognitive activity and some of these, indicators of dementia and Alzheimer's and stuff. I talk about one study in the book which shows that there's sort of like, there's not a great correlation between that. But part of the problem as well is that a lot of these studies are correlational. And so you look at, like, I don't know, one that always bugs me is like bilinguals have better, brain functioning in old age. And like, it's a correlational study, but then everyone draws like the, very tempting inference that, well, learning multiple languages is going to stave off Alzheimer's. And the issue is that, well, yeah, but people who have greater cognitive reserve, they have greater cognitive health, are more likely to learn and know other languages, So I don't want to say that it's definitive that it wouldn't help at all, but my thinking is that, again, I prefer the tool metaphor to the muscle metaphor. I think there's more support to that. So if you want to, in your old age, be more cognitively robust, then if you learned more when you were younger, if you did more things when your brain was healthy and you had more knowledge, that is going to protect in some sense against some degradation. It's just a little bit like if you owned 3 books in your library and then you had a fire and 2 of them burned down, you only have 1 book left. Whereas if you had 400 books and you lost like 10 or 20, you'd probably still be fine. And so I do think there's some sense that having mastered skills, having more kind of broad competencies is important. If you were talking about just brain health, I think the main implication I got from the research on aging and cognition is that the brain is a part of the body. And so if you were hoping on just this broad sense of like staving off some of these intellectual declines, staying physically healthy, avoiding a lot of things that would impact the body negatively, probably also help the brain for the same reason that, that it's all linked together. It's all, we're all made of meat. So that anything that helps your, heart health, your lung health is probably also going to indirectly help your brain health for some of the same reasons, So that would be my best prescription for someone who wants to stay healthy older.
So one of the things that I read online, that you had published a blog on mental models.
Yeah.
And we were talking about reasoning and rationality. And that's kind of what brought me to look into your work and got us to talk about this. So very interesting. You had digested like a 600-page book on this and provided kind of a nice TLDR summary for everyone. Could you just maybe describe a little bit what you learned on that?
So, the psychology of reasoning is a very interesting field. There's lots of different kind of like schools of thought and theories about it. But one of the ones that I'm really drawn to is Philip Johnson Laird. He's a kind of a psychologist, a cognitive scientist, and he published a book, I think in 1982, called Mental Models. And it sort of proposed his theory of mental models. Now, the theory itself in that book, if you read through it, has a fairly narrow scope. The question is, if you think about logical inference, so I give you syllogistic reasoning puzzles, and then I ask you to draw inferences about it. So, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal. What follows, right? And you say, well, Socrates is mortal. And the question he was proposing is, how do we do that? And logicians for a long time had this formal theory. And this is how, formal logic works, is that you do these kind of manipulations, these sort of mechanical manipulations of the sentences, removed from their semantic content. And that allows you to deduce things from them. This is how logic works. It's kind of like math. You're doing, you move the algebra around formal to get the statement you want, and you can formally deduce the answer. And his argument was that doesn't really fit the pattern of successes and errors in human reasoning. And so his theory of mental models is that what we do is that when we read something like that, we form this kind of abstract structure in our head where we say like Socrates is a man. And then we sort of instantiate in our head this kind of like, okay, well, there's this Socrates object and it has this property man. And then we have all men are mortal. And so, we populate the sort of mental world with like a few more other men in this kind of like abstract structure. And then we say, all men are mortal. So every single man in this little collection gets this little tag that also says mortal. And then when we want to deduce it, we just sort of like look at it and we see that Socrates also is mortal. And so we just make that conclusion. And so his theory of mental models, which again, it sounds like rather obvious when you think about it, but it has some important implications. And the idea is that when we fail at reasoning, often it's because to draw the correct inference, we have to create more than one mental model. So he gives examples in the book of syllogisms that almost everyone fails at. And the reason why is that to draw the correct inference, you have to make 3 different mental models and figure out what's true in all 3 of them. And that's kind of the upper limit of human mental ability. And so people will just either say something that's wrong, or they will say, no, there's no inference. There's nothing like interesting that you can say about that, which is false. And so his idea, which he really expanded, in his book, I think the book that I reviewed, How We Reason, was published maybe in like 2006 or something. I don't know. I someone will have to fact check me on that. But that book covered kind of in the 20 years after Mental Models was published, some of the ways that he's taken this theory and kind of it's faced intellectual challengers. And, obviously if you write in the kind of rationalist space, Bayes' rule and Bayesian reasoning is like one of the main kind of almost competitors to mental model theory. This idea of like reasoning is fundamentally probabilistic, and that we're kind of making these probabilistic judgments. My thinking is that they're probably just different cognitive mechanisms. That reasoning proper, like when you're actually thinking through things, is probably not Bayesian, is probably not probabilistic, but our intuitions probably are.
Bayesian is non-intuitive in a lot of people. It's been a problem.
Yeah,
to introduce Bayesian knowledge even into scientific studies has been a problem, because that's, you have the reproducibility crisis in a lot of these things that they just try testing things over and over again and can't reproduce it.
And Johnson Laird talks about that in that, like, well, what we're doing when we do probabilistic reasoning is we're doing this basic make a mental model of the situation and compare it to another thing. But when you do the mental models, you have to like kind of instantiate each of the possibilities. And sort of his argument is that by default, absent other information, we just kind of weight these hypothetical worlds we generate in our head equally. And so this sort of naturally overweights unlikely circumstances, because you have to create a mental model for that unlikely circumstance. But all the millions of permutations where those unlikely things don't happen tend to collapse down to one other mental model. And so unless we're sophisticated about it, and we're like more explicit about using base rates and, this sort of apparatus of mathematics, just by default, we have this availability heuristic because, well, I created a mental model for this, so it's probably likely. I made a mental model of the plane crashing that I'm on, even though, 99.999% of the time, none of those things happen. The other 99% of the time is just one other mental model. The plane landed safely. So I've got two in my head. And so I overweight that kind of unlikely probability, absent other information that might modulate that.
Interesting. Well, that's very cool. Okay. So you maybe just get a summary from you from your work in this book and what you're trying to get across to people. What would you say are like the most important learning methods, or maybe ideas that you could distill from this, that you would say tell your friends if if they're studying for an exam or something?
Yeah. I mean, the book kind of like breaks down. I've got like the very high level of like, what are the fundamental ingredients to getting better at things that you really need to pay attention to. And I talk about the book, seeing, learning from other people, doing, learning from practice, and feedback, learning from your mistakes or learning from your experience. But then also that kind of trickles down to this research where there's like much more specific tactics. So like I talk about variable practice and all this research. Excuse me. All this research has been done that shows that like if you want to learn a complicated skill efficiently, it helps to like take all the problems from your exam and shuffle them together, rather than do like, I'm going to do all the questions from this unit and then all the questions from that unit, because it improves the ability to recognize which problem belongs to which type, and you're better able to solve those things. So there's a whole section where I talk about that research. There's research on the value of retrieval over repeated review. So, one of the things I devoted a chapter to this in my previous book, Ultralearning, that, students frequently get this wrong, but they think that if you give them a text to study and they read it 5 times, they think they're going to do really well on the test, but they'd actually do much better on the test if you gave it to them once and then asked them to try to recall everything that was in it. So this free recall, trying to remember what was in the text, works better for memory than seeing it over and over again. And so this is a well-documented effect of retrieval practice.
So wait, give me that again. I didn't quite follow that. So if you read something multiple times, you don't remember it as well as if you read it once?
So here's the study that was done by Karpicki and Blunt, and I talk about it in Ultralearning. So they took people and they divided them into 4 different groups. One of the groups read the text once. The other group read it multiple times. One group made a concept map. So you read the thing and then you try to make some kind of diagram of all the information. And then the 4th group did free recall, which means you read it once, you close the book, and then you just try to remember everything you can from the text. And then after that, they asked them, how well do you think you're going to do on the test? And the people who were in the repeated review condition, the people who read this text multiple times, gave themselves the highest answer. Yeah. I'm going to do the best on this test because I've read it so many times. Whereas the people who did free recall gave themselves the worst answer because they're like, I can't remember anything from this thing. How am I going to do well on the test? But the funny thing is that when you actually test them, the free recall people do better than the repeated review people. And this is because retrieval practice, testing yourself, strengthens memory more than repeated review. Now, this doesn't mean, we were talking about social learning. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't even read the text once, because obviously you need to have something to retrieve. But it does show that, at least under some circumstances, this effect applies. And so this is one reason why flashcards work so well, as opposed to just reading a list of the vocabulary items or things you have to memorize, because actually trying to recall it is much more beneficial for strengthening memory. This is one reason why, when you're learning physics, they get you to do problem sets. I mean, there's other factors in problem sets, but because if I just show you demonstrations repeatedly, you're not going to be able to do it. Whereas if I give you the problem and now, you have some memory, you've seen how to do it before, and you attempt it yourself, you're much more likely to be successful. So the retrieval practice testing effect, this is a kind of a well understood literature, but not by students. Students don't know this stuff, and it impacts their choice of studying methods, because again, they have these cognitive illusions about what works. So I mean, that's one other tidbit. There's lots of these little fun kind of findings from the research on how to learn and study better.
It's very interesting. So flashcards, go get them if you want to learn.
Well, if you want to memorize things, definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So we're getting towards the end of our time slot here. Maybe just put out a plug for your book before we go. What do you want to leave people with?
Yeah. So, I mean, anyone who's interested in me or my writing or some of these topics, I know we talked about this essay on mental models I wrote, can check that all out at my website, scotthyoung.com. I have a free newsletter there. I have free ebooks, lots of material, a podcast of my own. If you're interested in the book, where we talk about these sort of fundamental ingredients of learning, how you can be a more effective learner, you can check out Get Better at Anything. It's available Amazon, wherever you get your books. I have an audio book version that I recorded myself, so you can get that on Audible. And I think now they're also offering them on Spotify too, so you can even look for it there if you have Spotify. And check out the book, and you can use that to get better at anything.
All right, I'd like to get better at everything. Thank you so much for joining us today, Scott.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And for spending the time. I'd be happy to send you a Rational View t-shirt.
I love that.
Awesome, that's great. So Scott Young, Get Better at Anything. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.